Welcome to the Prof Talk Pod, brought to you by the Engaged Professor. Every 2 weeks, join us as we talk about tips and tricks to help you connect with your students, engage with industry, and stay up to date on all the teaching trends. We'll give you actionable strategies that will help improve your teaching today. Thank you for being here. Let's get started. Hey everyone, welcome to the Prof Talk Pod. My name is Becky Aiken, and back with us this week is Dr. Galen Clavio. We missed you, Galen.
I really felt my absence, as I'm sure you all did as well. It's good to be back. It's good to see you. You know, it took the month of July off, but we're ready to roll for the new year.
I can't believe it's August. I woke up and I was thinking this is not actually real. But in 2 weeks, we start early this year at KU. We start on the 18th. So we got 2 weeks before classes start. So I'm getting a little anxious already, I think.
It's going to be fascinating to watch all this play out in terms of the calendar. I mean, it felt like July flew, and I think we start the 21st or 22nd. Or maybe I really need to figure out when we start. Actually, now that I think about it, it's one of those, I think this is a problem in administration. You get so tied up in school starting soon, you rarely have it in your head when the actual start date is. So we actually, I think, maybe start later. As I look at the calendar, yes, we do. So we are starting that last week of August, and the 25th is our first day, which is fine. I'll take that.
Yeah, I think it's interesting when you start early because really the week before is meetings and we have our teaching and learning summit and everybody kind of starts to get back in the swing of things. And I'm hiring right now a new full-time professor to practice. So like next week is full of meetings and getting that kind of rolling in the school. So I don't know, it just feels like I woke up today and now I feel like summer's over. So
Yeah, it's we're all kinds of things happening here in terms of just restructuring syllabi and Canvas sites and everything else. So keeping you busy, and then there's always the new initiatives that you're supposed to focus on as well at the start of the year. So fun all the way around.
But and that speaking of that, as I was thinking about what to talk about in August, it's been 10 years since I went to Illinois State University for my first full-time faculty job. And I taught at KU as a graduate teaching assistant, but that felt a little bit different, right? Because I could always lean on the fact with students that I'm a graduate teaching assistant. So I'm not maybe expected to be as good as somebody who has graduated and has their PhD and this is, their full-time gig. And so for students, assistant, associate, professor, those titles mean very little. Like to them, you're the professor. So in terms of level of experience, they kind of expect you to come in and know stuff. And so I've really been thinking about how it's been 10 years, which is wild for so many reasons, but it reminded me of how I felt around this time 10 years ago
Yeah.
thinking like, can I do this thing? Should I be doing this thing? How am I going to do this thing? And it really made me think about some advice we might be able to give for people who are starting out either, their first full-time tenure track role, maybe they're in a teaching focused position or they're a lecturer or even an adjunct. Maybe you just started as a professional helping teach and you're about to walk into a classroom, whether that be virtual classroom, a asynchronous, synchronous, or physically in a room. What would we tell ourselves on the first day? So yeah, I know this is a crazy one. I'm not going to let you tell me yet, Galen, because first I want to say, as I was thinking about this, and I'll be honest, this was like something that popped into my head yesterday, the day before we were about to record. So I threw a quick message on my LinkedIn. I text some people I know who've been doing this for a while and asked them like what were they thinking or what would they tell themselves if they could go back to their first day. And I got some responses that were kind of interesting. And actually two people said literally the exact same words. One of them is somebody we both know, Matt
Oh yeah.
Batska and Clint Warren. They both said be yourself, which it's funny that it seemed like almost an instantaneous thought. I text Clint and it was within 4 seconds that he responded with that, right? So I think that's kind of an interesting place to start thinking about, not trying to maybe be the person or emulate the person that was your professor, right? But like stay true to the things that make sense for you.
Yeah, I think A lot of it is probably the psychological barrier that most people feel when they get to college as undergraduates. Because, when you're in elementary school, everybody's an authority figure. And then by the time you get to high school, nobody's an authority figure, and that creates problems. That's why I would never want to teach at the high school level. But then you go to college and you feel like you've suddenly jumped up a level and you're back at the bottom of the totem pole. And now you've got these people who are oftentimes, they present much more professionally, or they carry themselves with a particular aura that is intimidating, I think. And a lot of undergrads and even some maybe especially grad students, I think, view professors as being on this different plane from an intellectual perspective, and they command a level of, I hate to say respect, because who respects anybody these days, it feels like, but whatever the closest thing is to that. And so when you decide you're going to go down the pathway of becoming a faculty member, I think a lot of people feel like they need to act that way, that they need to become that person. And it doesn't, I think what many people maybe don't understand is that a lot of what you see out of faculty members is just who they are. It just happens in many cases to fit this stereotype. But if you're not that stereotype, trying to become that stereotype can be the worst thing, because not only is it not you, but it's like aggressively somebody else. And that can really create a lot of internal problems with you as far as trying to figure out who you are and what you're supposed to be doing. I don't know. What do you think about that?
I definitely think that we kind of have this picture of what we think we should be as a professor, built on maybe ways we were told that we should act in some of our training, but mostly based on our experience with the professors we interacted with, maybe the people we respect. And so we do feel this pressure to be different than who we might be in any other work setting, right? Like in any other work setting, you interact with peers more. You're not necessarily in front of a room talking to people who we sometimes perceive this barrier between. Now, you and I have talked about how that barrier can be part of the problem in the classroom, but this kind of feeds into that, right? It's almost like you're trying to force yourself to create the distance if that maybe isn't something that's natural to you. Maybe it's very natural for you to walk into a room and like just have some small talk about something that really interests you, that students might be like, "Oh my gosh, they like, I don't know, I love trash TV," right? So like I love Love is Blind. And last spring I was talking to some of my students about it. And I could see they were like, this how can this person who is has a PhD like this trash TV show, right? And I think that's such a good suggestion from them to be yourself, because I know I tried to force myself into being like the people who I thought were great professors, and they were, but they were much more authoritative than I am, and set big boundaries, never talked about personal stuff, really didn't try to connect with students, and they were great teachers,
Right.
but that I tried to do that and I didn't get great evaluations, and part of me has wondered if it was because I was trying to be something I'm not, and it didn't work, right? It just didn't work.
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's funny because many of us will look back at the idiosyncratic faculty members who did talk about pop culture or their personal lives, or were really emotional in a positive way. And those will oftentimes be people's favorite professor that they'll remember. But then when you get into it, you feel like, and often are, being judged by faculty members for whom that's not a tool in the toolbox for them.
Right.
And I think it, you may be the type of person for whom that doesn't feel natural to be like that. But you might look at somebody who does it and say, wow, that person's getting great teaching evaluations, or people anecdotally talk about how much they love that class. Do I need to be like that? And if that's not you, that's not a good idea either. I think a lot of times people misinterpret what we talk about here as an argument for, be more outgoing, whatever. But it's always within the context of, how are you? Who are you? What are you doing that in your personal life that you feel like you can bring in, or do you feel like that's not appropriate? And if so, can you create a construct within your professional life that you feel comfortable with, that also does what you have to do in the classroom. And that it's one of those, like, be yourself, but also understand what the assignment is. And this is where I think for some faculty, they may not care that much about the teaching aspect because in their minds, I'm going to present the information. It's the student's job to learn the information, and that is where the exchange essentially ends. For others, they don't feel that way. But again, I think even that, there's a level of subjectivity and a level of self-determination to that approach that you have as a faculty member that a lot of faculty members don't realize that they have.
That's such a good point because it doesn't matter which way you're trying to force yourself, right? If you're somebody who likes to be more standoffish, if that's your general personality, you take longer to warm up, like pretending that you love pop culture or that you watch the same things or have the same lingo as the students in your classroom is also going to come off as disingenuous, awkward. You're going to throw yourself off in how you're running your class that day potentially, those things kind of spiral, right? If you're not feeling comfortable, then you can lose a whole lesson because you just kind of lost it.
Right.
You lost that focus. So I think that's such a good point, and that's probably one of my favorite ones that I heard was that be yourself. And I know it can be hard, especially as we think about maybe you don't exactly know who that is yet, and maybe you haven't figured out who you want to be as a professor, and that's okay. But I think the major takeaway is what you said, Galen, which is don't go in trying to be something, right? It's okay to just be you and figure out what you do and don't like as you go versus trying to emulate the thing that you think you should be.
And understand that it's a gradual process of learning what being in academia is about. And a lot of it is context dependent. It's what type of school are you at? Are you planning on staying at that school for the rest of your career? What is your so much of the early stages of being a faculty member, particularly if you're in a tenure stream position, I think is really about trying to figure out early what it is you're going to get out of the field and what you're going to put into the field. And realizing, I think, after a while that not everybody has to follow the same pathway. And there's actually a bunch of different little areas. If you're lucky, you have a mentor, or you have people that were on your dissertation committee, or you have other people who came through and maybe graduated a year ahead of you who can give you some pointers on what they're experiencing or experienced in the case of the people that have gone through it. And everybody's got to survive those first few years in pursuit of tenure or in pursuit of whatever your rank happens to be. But while you're doing that, I think you really have to figure out, what do I like, what do I want to commit time and effort and experiences to, and how do I craft an approach that's going to be true to who I am and want to be, while leaving room for the idea that that may change itself. It's funny because with undergraduate students especially, one of the things I talk about in media is, you at 18, many of you know what you want to do and you know what you want to be. And at 21, you know what you want to do and you know what you want to be. And at 25, you may no longer know because you've now done that, and you realize that it doesn't actually hold a level of self-satisfaction in your own heart that you thought it would. But you've got all of these skills, and hopefully you have an understanding of the field that you're in, where you can pivot to something that is going to allow you to achieve a higher level of self-actualization. Well, being a faculty member is no different. And a lot of it is really, you have to think about what you actually want out of the role, and the fact that there's a bunch of different pathways to get to that point.
And that ties actually really nicely with another comment that I got on the LinkedIn post from Leanne that said, "You're in in for a wild career. Just be patient, find your niche or niche, depending on the word you prefer, and enjoy." And I think that ties really into what you were saying, which is, you know, it it's not you don't always have to know right away, and that's okay. And it's okay to let yourself figure it out. Try some ways of being, some areas of interest, look at things that are happening in your field, talk to other faculty in and around the university to try to find where you fit. You don't have to know that right away. And I would argue that some of us change again, right? So let's say 10 years in, I'm completely changing my entire focus in academia right now in a way that I never would have anticipated 10 years ago. And I think, Galen, you've changed a couple times throughout your career as well after you'd been established in a place, in a thing. And so that's kind of what, and I think probably what Leanne was saying too, because I know she also has changed a few times where she's at and what she's focusing in. And I don't know that, we often think of those professors that maybe have been in the same university in the same field for 30, 40 years, that you find the expertise, you have it, and you stick with it. And I don't think that that's necessarily true for a lot of people in academia. And maybe something that's good to know as a newly minted assistant professor or teaching professor.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people, they'll get into academia, they'll do it for a few years, and they'll be like, this isn't for me, actually,
Right.
which is an interesting trend because it's a lot of work to, but, there are options outside of academia where your credentials still matter. But then a lot of people get into it and they're like, actually, I really like teaching. That's why I wanted to do it in the first place. And I don't really want to be going down a hard research pathway. Or, I'm at an institution I really like. I want to dig into the service aspects and I want to create structures that will outlive me or at least outlive my career. And I want to change the tenor of what we're doing to have it match what I think it should be based upon my background and what I think is interesting. So there's a lot of that where you do have a lot of flexibility. And I think people sometimes get caught up in the circumstances of their first job, but there's a whole nother set of circumstances that await you if you go somewhere else. There's a whole nother set of circumstances that await you if you stay in your position, but then you move into something else. And I think that just being open to that idea and being open to the idea that I may not have a a problem with pivoting down the road if I want to, leaving that option open for yourself and constantly thinking about what would this look like if I suddenly shot this direction or that direction. It really does, I think so. It's helpful, with businesses, with institutions of higher education. Everybody wants like a values statement or a mission statement. Well, what's your mission statement? Well, what is your mission statement as somebody who's in this profession? What are you trying to get out of it? And understand that your values might change, your mission might change, and that's okay as long as you're taking care of what you need to take care of in relation to your own career pathway and understanding that you don't have to get locked into one thing. You can change if you need to or want to. You just need to understand what the ramifications of that are. And that's where I think if I had to give my own self some advice, it's like, don't assume that you have to go. I mean, I have a degree from a discipline that's not really that close to what I'm working in now. I'm in a different school. I'm doing a bunch of different set of things. I mean, I had a professional background in that, but I didn't think that I would be able to combine that with what I was doing at the faculty level. And then suddenly, through a series of circumstances that I wasn't anticipating, suddenly I was able to. You may have that situation, you might have something completely different, but I think it's interesting that that even exists within this realm.
So, okay, so what I'm hearing is one of the things you would tell yourself is don't feel like you have to go down this path just because you started down it.
Right. And a lot of it is, well, what's your support network amongst the people that you're supposedly leaning on within the industry? Because they may not know. A lot. Don't assume. I guess maybe that's the other thing. Don't assume that everybody else is tuned into the same things you are, and don't assume that you're going to get good advice. I think those would probably be two additional things that I would say because and again, I think most people who get into this are intelligent. They're not always wise, but they're intelligent, and apply that to applying your intelligence to a circumstance and thinking through it is where wisdom comes from. And so I know sometimes it's well intentioned, but somebody for whom a certain set of things is why they got into the field is probably going to give you advice that suits them, that they think works for them, and therefore they think it will work for you. And that may just not be the case. You have to develop enough of a sense to be able to discern that from what would be good advice for you.
Oh, that's such a good, like, not all advice is good advice for you because all institutions are so different. And when you're getting advice, you're getting it from the set of circumstances, like you said, that that person knows that works for them. When I started, I had already started doing scholarship of teaching and learning research, and people told me, they said, you have to stop doing that until you have tenure, because you will never get tenure
Right.
if half of your research is in the scholarship of and teaching and learning, because the committee will look at your materials and they'll say, oh, this person doesn't have a research niche in their area. And I didn't listen at the time because it mattered to me to keep doing that research. And if I hadn't done that, if I'd stopped that 10 years ago, would I be doing this thing we're doing right now? Potentially not, right? Because I wouldn't have spent those 10 years developing knowledge and skills and interest
Right.
in this area to sit and talk with you on a mic every couple weeks about, quality teaching and learning and connecting with students. And so it was probably great advice for them, right? Because they knew somebody or had been told the same thing. And so they waited till they got tenure, then they jumped into trying to research teaching and learning. But for me, that just wasn't the right move, and it didn't have a negative impact on
Yeah.
me to make that different choice. So I think that's such a good idea of, like, advice is fine and take it all in, but it doesn't, just because the person has been doing this for 20 years doesn't mean that's the right advice for you.
One of the things I think is the advice I always give media school students here at IU is you have to be conscious of technology and how it changes what you want to do and what you're currently doing. And you have to be able to adapt. And I would give the same advice to any faculty member, because if media is the business that is most affected by technology and the way that you interact with your audience as part of your job, teaching at the college level might be the second most impacted area from a technological perspective. And I think what you're doing and what you've lined yourself up to do over the last 11 years that I've known you is a direct reflection of the capacity that we now have technologically to connect in ways that we didn't have in 2013, 2014.
Right.
And so I think you're to be commended for that. And I think the advice I would give people is, if you've got an idea and it doesn't look like you can do it, it doesn't mean that you shouldn't do it in smaller doses early, because all of that groundwork that you're laying will probably find a technological solution that will allow it to be done more broadly. And I think we see this in a lot of different walks of life, where things that you couldn't have even fathomed 15 years ago are now possible. Podcasting is a great example, just in general, where it's like that. The idea that you and I would have a platform to talk to people in our profession like this would have been ludicrous to think about from a production perspective, from a publishing perspective. It's no problem at all. Like, you just created a new intro video by yourself and uploaded it. That wasn't a possibility 15 years ago, unless you had very specialized skills and very specialized access to software or hardware. So, but these things, it, you can't take your current situation and assume that the rest of the future is going to be like it is in the present. And that is something you don't want. You're not hanging on hope, but I think you're looking now. You've got a problem in search of a technological conveyance, and that's something that will probably develop over time. Or you can figure out ways to take things that currently exist and move them in that direction.
Speaking of that, I think my friend Liz was trying to be like, she was being a little tongue in cheek, but her response was invest in Chat GPT. And I'm pretty sure she would tell herself to literally invest in it,
Right.
right? In Nvidia and the technology potentially. But also that kind of plays into your thought now, is like, don't assume that what the way that you're teaching, the way you're working with students, the way that you're doing research, or whatever part of your job today is going to be the same. And stay connected to the things that are changing and look at opportunities to take those ideas and move them forward. So I love that too. I was Your advice, you're such a media person, right? So you're definitely thinking about all of these ways that we evolve, because that's what you do. That's the world that you exist in. And I hope people who are not in our discipline, right? Sport management, marketing, media, listen to this and start to think about, what are some things that maybe are changing or evolving in my space,
Right.
and how can I take advantage of the technology and how I do my job and advance my career.
And I think for young faculty now, I think this was better advice for people 10 years ago, because that was the first wave of communication technology as it affects education. But I think we're still in that mode. What I would look at right now this makes older faculty uncomfortable, but a lot of those old faculty are like retired. But like the the thought leaders in academia historically have been people who published in traditional journals. I think the thought leaders in the new academia are the people who can best communicate their ideas in these sorts of venues, not just to fellow faculty, but can translate those ideas to the larger public. And I think in the fight for maintaining relevance as academics, as scholars, and understanding that the era of being able to just talk amongst ourselves and have that be the political capital that made you important, we're now entering almost like a battle phase where I think scholars that can put their ideas out there publicly are going to have cachet in the marketplace that scholars who don't won't. And so that doesn't mean that the ideas that the scholars that are focusing on traditional publishing aren't good or that those people don't deserve attention. It's just that the economy of the market is now moving in a different direction. And I think you've got to think about how can I leverage what tools are at my disposal effectively if I want to move in a direction where the ideas that I have and the research that I'm doing might have a greater public impact, which at the end of the day is what a lot of faculty say they want in the first place. So that's going to be something I think that's going to be interesting to watch. And I think if you're someone who's getting into the field now, it's just another argument for staying on top of it and learning how to communicate your ideas in more venues than conference proceedings or journals that aren't accessible to the mass public.
I'm gonna put that on my list of upcoming episodes, and I think that's a good thing for us to dive into a little bit more, is giving some examples of people that are doing that, and then talking a little bit about ways that faculty could get their ideas out there. Because I love that as something that if you're gonna do it, the earlier you start, the better. So that's definitely something that matters for all faculty, but I think our early career people thinking about just getting started, especially. So I'm gonna write that down. We're gonna cover that more later. So
Hey,
make sure you tune into future episodes,
this is
because I
what
think that's a great one.
I'm here. I'm here on episodes, coming up with new ideas for episodes as we go on the fly. That's what I'm here for.
That's good. I don't have to do it in the middle of the night. So if you do that, that's I stay up in the middle of the night thinking about the podcast. So um, there are a couple more. There's one more I want to get to from a colleague of mine who said, her name is Margaret, and said that she would tell herself, if she were going back to those first days, that if she made an impact on just one student, that that was a win, because there's so much that happens that we can't control within our classrooms, within students' lives, currently within the world that we live in, and not trying to, start too big. She would tell herself that, because I think it's overwhelming to think about, we've got 25, 30, 50, 200 students in this classroom. How am I going to make sure they all meet learning objectives, turn their work in on time, come to class? If you're somebody who got into this profession to make an impact, to feel like you were helping students, you're never going to reach them all. And I think that's a hard lesson to learn early on. And it's because some people aren't ready yet, and you can do everything you can do, but at some point you have to let it go, because it takes away from your ability to work with the students who are ready. Yeah, so I think that's such a good, focus point on, maybe if you can impact just one student, the work you're doing matters, and that doesn't mean you don't get better, but the work you're doing still matters.
Yeah, it's tough because I think the student faculty relationship is very different now than it was, because your reflection on being in the business as a full timer for 10 years, I think I'm at year 18 now. And it's interesting thinking back to what it was like in 2007 when I started as a visiting professor at University of Miami. It's, I feel like at the time, it was both easier to work with students on an individual basis in the context of a class without having to really address the things outside of class, because it just wouldn't have even been a consideration.
Right.
But also, I feel like at the time it was harder to contextualize, or let me put it this way: it's harder for students to contextualize the class in the spectrum of all the things they needed to think about, because classes just felt so removed from the world. And now classes live in this digital space alongside everything
Mhm.
else. And I think for faculty, there's a lot of philosophical things, and I don't know if that there's directly good answers to any of them. Like I talked about these people earlier, the people who feel like their responsibility is to provide information. It's the student's responsibility to be motivated to gather the information. And there's a resistance, and understandable resistance among many faculty, especially older faculty, to the idea that somehow they're responsible for their students' motivations or willingness to do the work. And I don't know what the trajectory of that is going to be down the line, because I will say even very heavily engaged faculty consistently now run into students who are just there to check boxes. And there are plenty of means by which to check those boxes where you're not actually learning the material. How much of a responsibility do you actually have as a faculty member? How much of that should you carry with you, versus saying at some point, these students were probably unreachable to begin with, so I have to focus on the ones that actually want to do things. It's I tend to lean more that direction, simply of I will do what I can to make the subject matter enjoyable, make it something that people feel like is a necessary step in their evolution, knowing that I'll probably not actually get all the people in the class on the same wavelength as I am in the 16 weeks that I've got.
I I'm gonna liken this to a real life experience right now. You can do your best to tell them that it will help them. My daughter has an ear infection, so I'm like telling her the medicine's gonna help her, right? The only thing that's gonna help her is if I give her this medicine. But I can't hold her down and make her swallow it. She has to swallow at some point, right? Same thing with students. Like you can communicate to them to do the best you can, but at some point, um, if they're there to check a box and they're fine just checking a box, or they don't see the value or don't care about the value, you can't force it down them. So this feels really real to me right now because that's
Yeah.
twice a day experience in my house. So I think that's such a good point to jump off of what Margaret was saying there is, I don't know, that's going to continue to evolve. And I think we'll probably circle back to that in another episode too, is like, what do we do with the checking the boxes, especially in a world of generative AI where checking the boxes is easier than it was 20 years ago to get by with. So see, there's two. We got two episode ideas already today.
Ah, just
So
just
I've got one more I want to share.
yeah.
I know we're running a little long. I think actually this would be a fun thing to do at a conference sometime, right? Is like get a panel of faculty out there and then just have this big group discussion about this. But one more I wanted to mention is remember that this is a huge one for me. This is something I wish I could tell myself. It's okay to be human. It's okay to have a typo on a slide and see the slide and say, "Oh, guys, that's a typo that I made."
Right.
It's okay to say something wrong, have a student raise their hand and say, "Actually, Dr. Aiken, this is what happened," and say, "Oh, that's my mistake. I didn't read the most updated piece of that," or something, right? It's you are a human, and striving to know all the things and be perfect in all the things and have everything buttoned up and no mistakes is exhausting and not going to serve you super well because you are a human in
Hmm.
the end, and humans
No,
make mistakes.
100%. I think sometimes, and it kind of goes back to this idea of the professor as the infallible, font of knowledge type of figure that some people feel like you have to do. I mean, you're going to make mistakes. It's fine. And it's fine to own the mistakes. I think where the problem is sometimes people will use that as an excuse for not being particularly accurate with what they're saying. And this is where I think you have to balance, because being human and making mistakes and being able to acknowledge them and just move on, I think is really useful in the classroom. But to some degree, it's like faculty are, you got what you believe personally, you've got what you need to teach. I think sometimes people confuse being human for, well, my feelings are as valid as anything, including the factual things that I'm supposed to be teaching to students. And I think a lot of the resentment that you'll hear in certain circles about faculty come from this idea that my views are infallible, or something along those lines. And probably everybody listening to this pod will be like, "Well, I don't. That's not true. I don't feel that way." But I think we've all been in the business long enough to know that there are people who do feel that way. And so I do think that you take what you do seriously, and take yourself seriously as someone who knows what they're talking about. Don't allow students who just disagree with you to disarm you to the point where you feel like you have to give credence to their ideas over yours simply because they disagree with them. But also don't take yourself unseriously, to the degree where people don't take you seriously. It's a fine line to walk sometimes. And that's where I think sometimes people, what it really comes down to is be self confident, because I think most of your own sense of humanity comes from feeling good about yourself as a human. And if you let little mistakes cut into your self perception, that's going to create a lot of problems that you can't easily solve.
Yeah, and definitely still make sure you're doing things like preparing for class, right? It's not a it be it's okay to be human and make mistakes. It's not a license for not doing the work
Right.
and just being like, yeah, it's fine. That's
Yep.
not a big deal. So I think that's a good way. Take yourself seriously, but not so seriously that a small mistake can derail your self-confidence. So that was a great point. Well, I think we probably could keep talking about this, but we're already over time. So we appreciate you all listening to this. I would love if you have additional things you would tell yourself for you to put them in the comments. You can always, DM me on LinkedIn. I'm happy to create another episode on this if I get a bunch more comments and there's some more things we can share, because it's really in that sharing that we can all get better. And if you find this podcast useful, this episode useful, please comment on it, share it with somebody you know, and subscribe to the pod. Thanks. And we'll see you next time.